Well, salutations to all. This is a deep discussion, a discussion which touches everyone, yet we are ignorant about it. It touches the future generations, the past, the present, and there might be people wondering if the discussion is worth it. For many people, the voice have been subjected to political control. Voice, the freedom of speech have been subjected to mass political control. However, I live in a nation where the freedom of speech is prominent, and one is allowed to speak about his mindset. Now, the strong arguments of today is very simple. Perfect nation. I ask you this: what is perfect nation? There are many theories. However, we cannot say for sure about absolute definition of a perfect nation. We can conclude the definition of perfect nation today. However, in terms of, for let's say, 600 years later, that definition can be changed. This subject matter is interesting because it touches us all. We're going to present some strong arguments. And of course, there's no script in front of me. It's going to be a heart-to-heart conversation. Everyone is free to speak, ask questions. In the future, we can do video conversations, take our turns, and speak about our mindset. Today is 17th of March 2021. We're going to take our date into consideration. For me, over here, it's very early. We are at spring. Cold is soothing, not extremely cold. The temperature matters, of course. Maybe somehow it changes our mindset or manipulates our mindsets. But anyway, let's go back to our main subject matter. This is a subject matter that will flourish over time. But more we talk about it, more we polish it. It will affect the positivity of future generation for sure. We need to start somewhere. We need to create a firmament in order to understand the importance of this subject matter. I ask you this again: what is a perfect nation? In a perfect nation, is happiness mandatory? What is happiness? Certain nations defines their nation's credit into happiness. Now, the nations, we also need to consider neighboring nations. Our perfect nation, which is in the midst of that neighboring nations, are the neighboring nations happy? Does the does the is the happiness of the nation selfish? Does it share its happiness to the neighboring nations? There can be many criticism on this. Other points can be dissolutions of our borders and countries, and considering Earth as one nation. humanity as the citizens of that one nation. This is also susceptible to many criticism, of course. Misinterpretation. We are not here to discuss about leaving out some ideas, but we are here to discuss about brainstorming, of course. For Earth, for the Earth to have one nation, that would require a tremendous amount of peace and accord. That is for sure. And many, in a way, if you think realistically, that depends on resources. We don't take resources into considerations. For now, some countries have abundance of fresh water, fossil fuel that is required to run their transportations. However, what about the future when the resources will be scarce? As the sea level rises, the salt water will infiltrate the fresh water. Will the natural disaster force certain nations to fusion with other nations? And eventually, can we say that at the end there will be one nation remaining? That is one concept to think about. I praise the nation that allows freedom of speech, because from freedom of speech comes greatest of innovations in terms of free thinking. Everything, all innovations, it starts with an idea, ideology. Now there can be many arguments about one nations. And by the way, I'm not gonna focus solely on this idea of one nation. All I'm saying that is part of an part of a strong argument. We'll move on to other ideas, of course. And will this one nation that represents the entire earth will be able to focus its energy, its manpower to create abundance of food or limitless food supply or limitless resources? And if there's questions of abundance, will they be able to preserve the abundance of food supply and resources for the future generations or future needs? Preservation matters. Reserves matters, because in times of needs, those are the most essential. Backup plan. Now let's move on to the next argument. I ask you again, what is a perfect nation? Happiness is good, Everyone wants happiness. However, where does happiness generate is generated from? Is it generated from knowledge? Is it generated from overall world peace or overall peace of one nation? Can the happiness of other nation affects the can the let me rephrase it. Can the happiness of surrounding nation affect the nearest nations? What is happiness? This is some deep thinking. Now, obviously, we don't have a script, but we need to brainstorm and ask ourselves, what is happiness, first of all? The subject is perfect nation. So, the happiness should be abundance in a perfect nation. How do you make the citizen happy? Of course, it is very hard to have economical stability in all area of one nation. However, there are certain programs that helps unemployment rate. What about sick citizens? How about free health insurance? What about famines? How about innovations such as certain nations promises rations, essential rations for all its citizens? There are countries like that. Now, once a nation runs out of resources, does it mean it's going to wage war to conquer other nations for its own benefit? Now we're jumping a little bit ahead of the subject. Let's focus, let's come back to the happiness. We can brainstorm many things, many ideas. Some countries already uses these ideas. Education is important for the happiness of the nation. Even in the midst of apocalypse, for example, or apocalyptical setting, knowledge of survival, for instance, equals to happiness. Now I'm just saying one example. Now let's talk about resources, basic needs, such as fresh water, cultivations, or food supply. These are very basic needs. Transportations, which needs fossil fuels. What what happens when a nation does not have these resources. A nation that is, for example, filled with most of its area is filled with a desert. The desert formation forms when there are scarcity of raindrops. Now, as the global warming, the temperature rising, as there are more and more carbon monoxide, which creates greenhouse effect, which increases the temperature. Over time, it will impact our temperature greatly. In those conditions, the that perfect nation needs to export its food supply, its energy from the neighboring nations. And if the neighboring nations are their adversaries, they'll need to come into a diplomatic understanding and agreement. If that does not, that perfect nation needs to focus on diplomatic exports from elsewhere. Overall, a perfect nation should also focus on clean energy. Now, nuclear energy is good, but it creates radiation substances. And unfortunately, it takes several years for them to disappear. And there needs a place to store all these radioactive substances. So overall, in terms of clean energy, we cannot conclude that these are clean energy. Solar power is solar power or solar innovative energy and electrical energy. We can conclude these are truly amazingly clean energy. Now, of course, electricity can be generated from waterfall, for example, by creating dams. In return, dam creates mercury and pollutes the river water. However, there are other ways of creating electrical energy, such as from the current of the ocean, wind power, etc. And my hat goes to the perfect nation that are already creating and focusing on innovative ideas to create clean energy. Because clean energy equals happiness and the firmament for the future generation. Happiness is in a perfect nation also arises from the freedom of speech of their citizen. I live in a nation where freedom of speech is valid. we can speak our mind out. A nation which does not promote freedom of speech is a nation that is subjected to disaster, in my opinion, of course. In terms of innovation and advancement, it will stagnate itself. There will be no place for innovation in education, ideas, social advancement, etc. Now, this is a very big idea to discuss. I invite anyone who is willing to discuss and critique. Welcome. I'll be doing several times this program. This is an idea that needs to be polished, discussed. I might be saying one thing, but I welcome criticism because criticism is important in order to polish the perfect ideas. A perfect nation should have several types of diplomacy with its neighboring nations. There are nations, however, that even with diplomacy, they're not satisfied due to their agendas, personal agendas. Now, this should not despair the perfect nation because perfect nation should continue its diplomacy, and it should also publicize internationally it's doing to take into account for all the good things they have done. Because without count, without publicity, in when it's gonna come in, when that perfect nation will have their dire need situation, they will need some sort of armament to receive aid from other nations that are willing to give aid. Now let us go back to our subject matter. I ask you again, what is a perfect nation? Now this subject matter is, let us just say, chapter, chapter 1, discussion of the main subject matter. The main principal subject matter of this so called publication is the main title, is the future of humanity. Now we are doing this discussion, deep thought, brainstorming in order to come into conclusions of certain great ideas, ideology, positive ideology, toward that main title, which is future of humanity. Our chapter 1 is Perfect Nation. We chose Perfect Nation as chapter 1 for a certain reason, because the nation matters. A nation in which all its citizens are happy, they can identify themselves as the interest of the nation, as the citizen of that nation. They don't feel neglected or rejected. That nation is praiseworthy. That nation is a bliss. I want to be a part of that blissful nation. Do you not agree? So, the strong argument of this discussion is public interest. Public interest coincides. This, or let's rephrase it. Citizen interest coincides with with its nation's interest. So citizenships, I mean, sorry, citizens' interest coincides with its nation's interest. And of course, all this ideology might not matter to some, but to some, it will create certain types of positive vibe, at least. There might be massive effect to this program, such as changing a certain person to think differently, not as a present person or not what he is right now, but think about the future generations. If you ask me, I would say 90% of the world is focused on world of today. They're not worried about the world of tomorrow. The upcoming generation matters. Yes, there have been bold steps by certain nations to come up with innovative ideas to increase climate, to increase the fight for climate change. But none of the nation have taken any bold steps. And the funny thing is, many nations are ignorant about the climate change. Whether you not agree or agree, the truth is, in our lifetime, speaking about the millennial, of course, we'll see the North Pole entirely melt. That is the truth. And the second situation is with the emission of carbon monoxide currently ravaging our planet, our one and sole planet, habitable in the solar system, is subject to a great unpredictable catastrophe. It takes thousands of years for temperature to balance itself. In future, there might not be even breathable air or breathable oxygen. In future, there might be an apocalyptical moment where everyone needs to live in a bio-shaped biodome, and then they would need to create their own oxygen in order to venture out. That is one possibility, of course. So I ask you again, what is a perfect nation? A very strong argument would be a perfect nation focuses on preparing itself for the worst possibilities. A perfect nation always focuses on the unpredictable consequences. They're always prepared, no matter what. That is a strong argument toward a perfect nation. For example, for for now, let's forget about many several countries that exist in this earth. We live in such a dangerous zone in the galaxy. We are so much worried about political affairs, relationship with other nations, that we forget to see the big picture. We are just a point in a cosmos, subjected to get extinct at any moment. Now, one might think, we'll be able to foresee the future disaster, we'll be able to escape it. Yeah, if there's a comet or an asteroid, we're gonna have enough time to repel it, change its trajectory. But the facts, the facts needs to be considered. There's no such technology yet, and if an asteroid or comet was in trajectory to collide with our Earth, the question is, will there be enough time? Now this year we're very lucky. NASA Space Agency has taken a bold step to try and repel a trajectory of an asteroid. Very plausible, very positive innovation. Many nations does not see the benefit of this mission. However, many fail to understand that comets and asteroids are not the only tragic that can happen to Earth. There are planets. For example, let's take example of Jupiter, for example. At any time, it can change its current rotation, and it starts ravaging other planets that are close to the sun, for example, Mars, etc. None of the planets are stable in terms of rotations. We cannot predict that it will not. We cannot predict that it will always rotate in its current to its current rotational behavior. A planet can change rotational behavior at any time. And other than planet, there's also a black hole. Yesterday, I was surprised to read the news about black hole that are active, the wonders on the Milky Way freely, not just on the center. And what about magnetars? A magnetar can at any moment explode at a great distance and still extinct our species. Now the argument is the perfect nation prepared for all terms, all kinds of calamities, disasters? If it is, then I praise that nation, and I'll be the first to submit my citizenship toward that perfect nation. Now, as I have mentioned before, the scarcity of resources might force certain nations to fusion with other nations in the future. This is called globalization, of course. There might even be a time when the earth has one nation due to its increasing amount of depletions of resources. We cannot conclude anything with certainty about the future of humanity. but we can break down the picture into chapters. And the first chapter would be, you know what, perfect nations. So I ask you again, what is a perfect nation? What is a perfect nation? What is the description of perfect nation? Present me with the arguments. One thing that is not taken into consideration is the educational system when we talk about perfect nation. Should or shall the educational system be free? There are certain nations that have done it, freedom of educations. Those nations have also experienced great vast amount of unemployment rate. Because the thing is, we also need laborer or workforce to work in certain sectors that requires manpower. Now we don't take these deep thoughts into consideration, of course, but I welcome you to delve into this ideology. Is freedom of education be free in the perfect nation? I would say yes. Freedom of educations or free education is important. Now, certain nations fears this because there will be less labor force in certain sectors, which requires manual labors. If everyone was educated, who will work on those sectors? Now, there are many other arguments, of course. But if we learn as humanity, we learn to think positively, there will be always room for positive ideas, positive ideology. For instance, the sectors that requires labor or manual labor, they can export immigrants. Example A. Example B would be higher wages paid to manual laborer. Example C would be higher incentive for manual worker. And there are rooms for all kinds of explosions of ideas that can create innovations. Now, one might ask, what is the need of such a program? The need of this program is very important because not many channels discusses these issues heart to heart without a script. And how many discussions of such type is genuine? Genuinity comes from a mindset of freedom of speech. We need to be exemplary. We need to be precise. It is okay if we take a little bit of pause before we speak our mind out. There are many things to be considered, such as the impact of speech can be disastrous to some or certain nations. However, this does not mean that we shouldn't speak our mind out. We should consider consequences, this and that, and still speak. As a philosopher, we have the right of freedom of speech. So let us go back to the subject matter. What is a perfect nation? What is that? What is a utopian nation? A perfect nation are great environmentalists. They cares about environment. They cares about preservations of their mountains, trees, etc. They do not focus on destroying the landscapes of mountains, such as for the reason of mining or founding a city, metropolitan city, etc. They don't chop down their trees excessively, or shall I say, not at all. There are always innovative ideas to create imitations or artificial furnitures to fulfill the needs of furnishing the apartments or the offices, etc. Furnitures needs to be in consideration, of course. The desk in which my monitor is mounted upon, the computer chair in which I'm sitting on the bed which I sleep, What are the materials that are used to create such things? Mostly chopped down trees, mined materials, this and that. Materials that comes from mining, etc. There shall be consideration of increased quality when it comes to furnitures, so they do not expire rapidly. They last for several years. We should learn to preserve our furnitures as much as possible. I mean, to be honest, I've been preserving my computer table for more than 15 years now, which is a good thing. I don't just change my computer table just like that. And I haven't been in one place. I've moved several times from this building to that building, but I always kept my computer table. The sofa behind me was purchased on 2019, for example. I never had a sofa, so this is my first sofa. And for me, it's historical, but for many, it doesn't have any value, of course. A perfect nation is less materialistic. That is a that is an is that like that is a strong argument, of course. Materialistic attachment creates chaos. We should be happy with what we have. Now, for instance, if my computer table broke down, I would definitely buy a new one. Just because I don't like it anymore, I don't need to buy a new one right now. We need to consider all this. We need to take into consideration all this. Materialism matters. Sign me up for the nation which is non-materialistic. I want to be a I want to be a part of that perfect nation. There are certain nations that focuses on gold consumptions. There are certain nations even expert on consuming edible gold. This falls into the materialistic category. Now, where's the nations where its citizens are non-materialistic? Because that is a perfect example of a perfect nation. Let us go back to the main argument, of course. What is a perfect nation? A perfect nation is an expert of defense and offense. What is the point of creating a perfect nation which cannot defend itself and defensively be offensive when it is attacked again and again? Why vouch for a nation that is weak in defense and all the hard work of innovations and advancement have been preserved, have been stolen or destroyed? That nation should be perfectly organized in terms of its own defense and in offense. A perfect nation focuses on its defense and offense, not solely on its own nations, but also the needing nations of its planets of residence. There are nations that have low capabilities of defense, and the perfect nations have overwhelming power of army, weaponry, mechanical units, organic units at its disposal, and its and the nation, perfect nations shall not be solely focusing selfishly on its own defense and only on its own offense, but also help other needing nations. There are so many nations that have done many projects for the United Nations, for example, helping the poor country where the countries do not have military resources. They have even donated foods. You can look them up. In this discussion, I'm not gonna discuss about this. I'm not gonna name a specified country. I'm gonna speak generally because I do not want misunderstanding but innovations of ideas. So I praise the nation, that perfect nation, which will focuses on self-defense, offense in the name of its in the name of its national defense, to give a strong judgment on its adversaries. A nation that is not a warmongering nation, but focuses on humanitarian actions, such as helping other nations in needs of military power. Sign me up for that nations. I wish to be there. first citizen of that perfect nation. More and more we speak about perfect nation. The idea, the ideology of perfect nations will be polished. And one day we'll be able to say we have polished the ideology and quality of perfect nations in its maximum potency, without a doubt. There no needs to be quick conclusion, of course. There is no need of quick conclusions of anything. We live in a universe where the universe appears to be limitless, without boundaries. Even if we focus on a black spot on the universe, we end up discovering primordial galaxies. So the ideology should not be limited in terms of knowledge, but ongoing, like the limitless universe. I started the discussion on 16th of March 2021. The recording was not so good. However, I decided to redo the recording according to my own will. Hopefully, it will bring some change to certain someone positively, because that is the needed trust for humanity in order to advance toward the perfect nation. Now, in reality, I'm a speedy speaker, but the subjects that are a little bit bald needs to be spoken in slow manners, in coherent manner, in some sort of divided forms, presentable, because it falls into certain categories. In certain countries, those categories are might be banned. So I need to find a tune of universal harmony. I cannot just make a mistake and say, oops, I made a mistake in this conversation. It might have a great impact. But overall, so far, everything we have discussed has a deep meaning. People with patience, that loves listening, that loves sharing, that are open minded, I welcome them to delve into these ideas. And hopefully, we'll coincide and we'll be able to chat and discuss criticism and expand our ideas together in future. This is just the first video, and I would say we'll sign out right here. End of streaming.